Video 1. Hermeneutics 101, Eschatology. Why Christians disagree about the end times. Big idea. People often disagree because they begin with different assumptions. Introduction. If you have spent any amount of time around Christians, you have probably noticed something interesting. People who love the same Messiah, believe the same Bible, and sincerely desire to know the truth can reach very different conclusions about the end times. One believer is convinced that the millennium of Revelation 20 must be a literal 1,000-year reign of Messiah upon the earth. Another believer is equally convinced that the 1,000 years should be understood symbolically. One Christian believes the tribulation is still entirely future. Another believes portions of biblical prophecy were fulfilled long ago. Some see a strong distinction between Israel and the church. Others see continuity between the people of Elohim throughout Scripture. The disagreement itself is not difficult to see. What is difficult is understanding why it exists. How can people read the same Bible and come away with such different conclusions? How can sincere believers study the same passages and yet build completely different prophetic systems? Many people assume the disagreement begins when the Bible is opened. In other words, they assume the difference is found entirely within the text itself. But what if the disagreement often begins before the text is ever opened? What if many of our conclusions are being influenced by assumptions that we brought with us long before we arrived at a particular passage? That is the question we will begin exploring in this lesson. Now, before anyone misunderstands where we are going, let me say something very clearly. This series is not primarily about proving a particular end times position. There are plenty of studies that attempt to do that. The purpose of this series is different. Our goal is to learn how to think about Scripture. Our goal is to learn how to examine evidence, identify assumptions, ask better questions, and handle the biblical text responsibly. Throughout this series, you are going to hear me repeat a statement over and over again because it serves as the foundation of everything we are about to study. I do not care what a passage means to me. I do not care what a passage means to you. I do not care what a passage means to my favorite teacher. I want to know what it meant to the man who wrote it. That is the goal. If we can learn to ask that question consistently, many difficult passages suddenly become much easier to approach. The challenge is that none of us come to the Bible as completely neutral readers. Every one of us arrives carrying beliefs, experiences, traditions, teachings, and assumptions. Some of those assumptions may be correct. Some may be incorrect. But whether they are right or wrong, they still influence how we read the text. And that brings us to our first hermeneutics checkpoint. Hermeneutics checkpoint. Before we examine what other people believe about the end times, let us begin with a more personal question. What assumptions am I bringing to the text before I even begin reading? Not what assumptions does my pastor have. Not what assumptions does my denomination have. Not what assumptions do people on the internet have. What assumptions do I have? That question may prove to be more important than any prophetic chart we will ever examine. Chapter 1. Where our assumptions come from. Imagine meeting someone from a different part of the country and immediately noticing that they speak with a different accent. Perhaps they pronounce certain words differently. Perhaps their speech patterns sound unusual to your ears. Most people never stop to ask themselves how they acquired their own accent. They simply speak the way they have always spoken. The reality is that very few people consciously choose an accent. We inherit it. We absorb it from our environment. We learn it from our parents, our friends, our community, and our culture. By the time we become adults, it feels completely natural. In fact, we often do not even realize we have an accent until we encounter someone who sounds different. Interpretation often works the same way. Many of our theological assumptions were absorbed long before we ever began carefully studying Scripture for ourselves. We learned them from people we trusted. We learned them from churches we attended. We learned them from books we read, sermons we heard, conferences we attended, study Bibles we used, and conversations we had with other believers. None of this is necessarily bad. Every one of us learns from others. In fact, it would be impossible not to. The problem arises when we mistake inherited assumptions for established conclusions. The problem arises when we stop asking where our ideas came from and whether they can withstand examination. For example, if someone asks why you believe a particular view of the millennium, can you trace that belief back to the biblical evidence that convinced you? Or would you discover that your belief was largely inherited from trusted teachers? Again, that does not automatically make the belief wrong, but it is an important question. The same thing could be asked about the tribulation, the rapture, Israel, the kingdom, Revelation, Daniel, or any number of prophetic subjects. Where did those ideas come from? Did they come directly from your own study of Scripture? Were they inherited from your church tradition? Were they learned from books and teachers? Were they absorbed through years of repetition without much investigation? One of the greatest myths in biblical interpretation is the idea that we approach the text as completely neutral observers. We do not. I do not. You do not. Scholars do not. Pastors do not. Everyone brings assumptions to the text. The goal of hermeneutics is not pretending those assumptions do not exist. The goal is learning to recognize them. The goal is becoming aware of the lenses through which we read. Imagine two people looking through different colored lenses. One is wearing blue-tinted glasses, and the other is wearing red-tinted glasses. Both are looking at the same object. The object itself has not changed, yet each person's perception is being influenced by the lens through which they are viewing it. In a similar way, assumptions influence how we approach Scripture. They influence which details stand out to us. They influence which interpretations seem obvious. They influence which explanations feel convincing. That is why one of the most important questions we can ask is not merely, "What do I believe?" but rather, "Why do I believe it?" Because if we never examine our assumptions, we may spend years defending conclusions that we have never truly investigated. And that leads us naturally into our next question. If assumptions shape interpretation, where did many of those assumptions come from? To answer that question, we need to spend a little time looking at history. Not because history determines truth, but because history helps us understand where many ideas originated and how they developed over time. Chapter 2. Christians have not always agreed. One of the most common assumptions people bring to theological discussions is the belief that their particular view has always been the Christian view. Sometimes that assumption is spoken openly, other times it remains unspoken, but it often sounds something like this. Well, Christians have always believed this, or perhaps, this is what the early church taught, or this is the historic Christian position. Now, there are times when such statements may contain an element of truth. There are certainly doctrines that have been broadly affirmed throughout Christian history: the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah, the future resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, the return of Messiah. These beliefs have been widely embraced across many different traditions. However, when we move beyond those broad foundations and begin discussing the details of eschatology, the historical picture becomes much more complicated. Questions about the millennium, the tribulation, the timing of prophetic events, the identity of Israel, the interpretation of Revelation, and the relationship between symbolic and literal language have often produced differing conclusions among sincere believers. That reality surprises some people. Many assume there was once a golden age when every Christian interpreted prophecy exactly the same way. History does not really support that assumption. Now, before we continue, let me make an important clarification. History does not determine truth. Let me say that again, in case you missed it. History does not determine truth. Scripture determines truth. The fact that someone believed something in the 2nd century does not automatically make it correct. Likewise, the fact that a particular view became popular later in history does not automatically make it wrong. Our purpose is not to discover which interpretation had the most followers. Our purpose is not to discover which interpretation appeared first. Our purpose is to understand how different views developed and how assumptions were often passed from one generation to the next. Why? Because understanding where an idea came from is often the first step toward evaluating that idea fairly. Imagine two people debating a particular prophecy. One assumes his interpretation has been universally accepted throughout church history. The other assumes his interpretation was the original view held by all believers. What happens if both assumptions are wrong? Suddenly, the discussion changes. Instead of defending traditions we inherited without examination, we become willing to investigate the evidence for ourselves. That is one of the great benefits of historical study. History cannot tell us what Scripture means, but history can help expose assumptions we may not even realize we are carrying. And once those assumptions are exposed, we are in a much better position to evaluate them. Now, at this point, a thoughtful listener might ask an important question. If we are going to discuss what early Christians believed, how do we know what they believed? How do we know what Justin Martyr taught? How do we know what Irenaeus believed? How do we know what Augustine wrote? How do we know what Darby taught? Those are exactly the kinds of questions we should be asking. In fact, asking those questions demonstrates that we are beginning to think like careful investigators rather than passive consumers of information. So before we look at a few historical examples, we need to talk briefly about evidence. How do historians actually know what historical figures believed? And how can we evaluate those claims responsibly? That question will be the focus of our next chapter. Hermeneutics checkpoint. Before moving forward, ask yourself, have I ever assumed that my current view was simply the view Christians have always held? If so, how do I know that assumption is true? What evidence would I use to support that claim? Remember, our goal is not merely to inherit conclusions. Our goal is to examine them. Chapter 3. How do we know what early Christians believed? Imagine that someone tells you, the early church believed this, or perhaps, the early church rejected that. How should we respond? The answer is not blind acceptance. The answer is not automatic skepticism either. The answer is evidence. We should ask, how do we know? What sources support that claim? Can we examine those sources for ourselves? This is actually one of the reasons I enjoy studying history. When historical documents survive, we are not forced to rely entirely on second-hand reports. We can often go directly to the writings themselves. For example, we know a great deal about Justin Martyr because many of his writings still exist. We know a great deal about Irenaeus because his writings still exist. We know what Augustine believed because his writings still exist. In each case, we can read their words and evaluate their arguments. That is a very different thing from simply repeating what someone else says they believed. Now, not every historical figure is equally well documented. Papias provides a good example. Much of what Papias wrote has been lost. We do not possess complete copies of his works today. However, portions of his writings were quoted and discussed by later historians and church writers. Because those quotations survived, we can still learn something about what Papias taught, even though his original works largely disappeared. This introduces an important principle of historical investigation. Not all evidence carries the same weight. A surviving document written by the person himself is generally stronger evidence than a later summary written by someone else. That does not mean later summaries are worthless. It simply means we should recognize the difference between primary and secondary evidence. The same principle applies when studying Scripture. A direct statement from a biblical author should generally carry more weight than assumptions we build around that statement. Evidence matters. Sources matter. Context matters, and the willingness to examine those things carefully is one of the habits that separates serious study from casual opinion. As we move forward, we are going to look briefly at a few historical figures. Our purpose is not to place them on a pedestal. Our purpose is not to treat them as authorities equal to Scripture. Our purpose is much simpler. We want to observe the historical evidence. We want to see what they actually said. And we want to allow that evidence to help us understand how different eschatological assumptions developed over time. So let us begin with some of the earliest Christian writers after the New Testament and examine what we can learn from them. Chapter 4. Early Christian Expectations. Now that we have discussed how historical evidence works, let us look at a few examples. Again, our purpose is not to prove that these men were correct, nor is our purpose to prove that they were mistaken. Our goal is much simpler. We want to observe what they believed and what their writings reveal about early Christian expectations concerning the future. One of the earliest figures commonly discussed in these conversations is a man named Papias. Papias lived in the late 1st and early 2nd century. Unfortunately, most of his writings have not survived. What we know about him comes largely through quotations and discussions preserved by later writers. One of those later writers was Eusebius, a church historian writing in the 4th century. While discussing Papias, Eusebius tells us that Papias expected a future earthly kingdom following the resurrection. Interestingly, Eusebius himself did not agree with Papias and believed he had misunderstood certain passages. That detail is worth noticing. Even among early Christian writers, interpretation was being discussed and debated. The point is not that Papias proves a particular view. The point is that these conversations were already taking place very early in Christian history. Now let us move forward to a man whose writings have survived in much greater detail. Justin Martyr. Justin lived during the 2nd century and is one of the most important Christian writers outside the New Testament period. Because many of his works still exist, we do not have to rely entirely on later summaries. We can read his own words. In his work Dialogue with Trypho, Justin describes his expectation of a future kingdom and a future 1,000-year reign associated with Jerusalem. But then he says something particularly interesting. Justin explains that he and others who are, in his words, right-minded Christians on all points, believe there will be a resurrection of the dead followed by 1,000 years in Jerusalem. Yet in the very same discussion, he acknowledges that many who belong to the pure and pious faith and are true Christians think otherwise. Notice what makes this quotation so valuable. The most important part is not actually Justin's view of the millennium. The most important part is his acknowledgement that sincere believers disagreed. Think about that for a moment. Justin is not describing heretics. He is not describing unbelievers. He specifically refers to people who belong to the pure and pious faith and are true Christians. In other words, by the middle of the 2nd century, we already find evidence that faithful believers did not all agree on every detail of eschatology. That observation alone should encourage humility. Sometimes modern Christians act as though disagreement itself proves someone must be rejecting Scripture. Yet here we find a respected early Christian writer acknowledging that faithful believers held differing conclusions. Justin's quotation also helps document his own expectation of a future kingdom associated with Messiah's reign. Again, our goal at this point is not to decide whether Justin was right. Our goal is simply to observe the historical evidence. Now let us move to another important figure, Irenaeus. Irenaeus lived during the 2nd century and was one of the most influential Christian writers of his era. He is particularly significant because he had connections to earlier generations of believers. Irenaeus tells us that he knew Polycarp, and Polycarp had known the Apostle John. That connection does not automatically make every conclusion of Irenaeus correct, but it does make him an important historical witness. In his work titled Against Heresies, Irenaeus describes a future resurrection, a future kingdom, and a future reign of Messiah. Like Justin, he is often cited as an example of early premillennial expectation. As we examine these early writers, a pattern begins to emerge. Many of the earliest Christian sources that discuss these subjects appear to expect a future kingdom associated with Messiah's return. Now let me immediately add an important clarification. That observation does not settle the debate. History never settles the debate. Scripture settles the debate. I just don't think I can stress that point enough. The fact that an early Christian writer believed something does not automatically make it true. But history does help us understand what people believed and when they believed it. And that brings us back to the purpose of this lesson. Different views have histories. Different assumptions have histories. Ideas do not appear out of nowhere. They develop, they spread, they are taught. They are inherited. And over time, many believers come to assume that what they inherited is simply what everyone has always believed. But history reveals a more complicated picture. As church history continued, another interpretive approach would become increasingly influential, shaping Christian thinking for centuries. To understand that development, we need to look at one of the most influential figures in the history of Christianity, Augustine of Hippo. Hermeneutics checkpoint. As you listen to these historical examples, ask yourself, am I evaluating evidence, or am I merely looking for historical figures who already agree with me? Those are not the same thing. The purpose of historical study is not to collect allies. The purpose of historical study is to understand the evidence. Chapter 5. Augustine and a Shift in Influence. As we move forward through church history, we encounter one of the most influential Christian thinkers who ever lived. His name was Augustine of Hippo. Whether someone agrees with Augustine or disagrees with him, it is difficult to overstate the impact he had on Christian theology. His writings influenced generations of pastors, scholars, theologians, and church leaders. In many ways, Augustine became one of the most important voices in the development of Western Christianity. That is why understanding his influence matters, not because Augustine determines truth, not because Augustine serves as our final authority, but because influential ideas often shape the assumptions that later generations inherit. Earlier, we saw that many early Christian writers expected a future earthly kingdom associated with the return of Messiah. Augustine approached some of these prophetic passages differently. In particular, Augustine came to understand the 1,000 years described in Revelation 20 in a more symbolic manner. Rather than expecting a future 1,000-year earthly kingdom in the same way many earlier writers had envisioned it, Augustine increasingly connected the 1,000 years with the present age of the church and the present reign of Messiah. Now, once again, our purpose at this point in the investigation is not to determine whether Augustine was right, nor is it to determine whether he was wrong. That discussion belongs elsewhere. Our purpose is simply to observe a significant historical development. A different interpretive approach was becoming influential. And influence matters because influential interpretations often become traditions. Traditions become teachings, teachings become assumptions, and assumptions are frequently inherited by later generations and then defended rigorously. This is one of the reasons historical study can be so valuable. It helps us recognize that many ideas we assume are self-evident actually have a history behind them. Sometimes that history stretches back hundreds of years, sometimes more than 1,000. Consider how often people speak about the traditional view. Traditional according to whom? Traditional during which century? Traditional within which branch of Christianity? Those questions matter because Christianity has existed across many centuries, cultures, and traditions. A belief that feels ancient to one group may seem relatively recent to another. A belief that feels obvious to one tradition may be unfamiliar in another. Understanding that reality helps us approach theological disagreements with greater humility. Instead of assuming that everyone who disagrees with us must be ignoring Scripture, we begin to recognize that many disagreements arise because people inherited different interpretive traditions. Again, that does not mean every tradition is equally correct. It simply means that traditions exist, and if traditions exist, they should be examined. This brings us back to one of the recurring themes of this series. The goal is not to discover what tradition says. The goal is not to discover what my denomination says. The goal is not to discover what my favorite teacher says. The goal is to discover what the biblical author intended to communicate. History can help us understand how interpretations developed, but only Scripture can determine whether those interpretations are true. I'm gonna say it one more time. Only Scripture can determine truth. As the centuries passed, Augustine's influence became widespread throughout much of Christianity. For many generations, his approach to prophetic interpretation shaped how large portions of the Christian world understood the millennium and other eschatological subjects. If the story ended there, the history of eschatology would be much simpler. But it did not end there. Centuries later, new approaches would emerge, new systems would be developed, and new assumptions would spread throughout the Christian world. To understand many of the prophetic discussions taking place today, we need to move forward to the 19th century and examine two names that continue to influence modern eschatology: John Nelson Darby and C I Scofield. Hermeneutics checkpoint. When I encounter a long-standing tradition, do I automatically assume it is correct simply because it is old? When I encounter a newer interpretation, do I automatically reject it because it is new? Remember, just because it's new to you doesn't mean it's new. You just may have never heard it before. Neither age nor popularity determines truth. Ideas must be examined on the basis of evidence. Chapter 6. Darby, Scofield, and Modern Assumptions. As we move from the ancient world into the modern era, we arrive at a period that continues to shape many eschatological discussions today. If Augustine helps us understand the development of certain interpretive traditions within much of historic Christianity, John Nelson Darby helps us understand the development of another influential approach that would eventually spread throughout much of the English-speaking world. Darby was born in 1800 and became associated with a movement known as the Plymouth Brethren. During the 19th century, he developed and systematized an approach to biblical interpretation that would later become known as dispensationalism. Now, before we go any further, let me once again emphasize the purpose of this lesson. We are not asking whether dispensationalism is true. We are not asking whether dispensationalism is false. Those are important questions, but they are not the questions we are addressing right now. I deal with those questions in a video I produced titled Testing Dispensationalism. For this eschatology series, however, the question we are asking is historical. What influenced modern eschatological thinking? Darby's work became one of those influences. Many of the prophetic ideas that are familiar to modern Christians gained widespread exposure through dispensational teaching. Concepts involving prophetic eras, distinctions between Israel and the church, and particular approaches to future prophecy became increasingly influential during this period. Again, the purpose is not to debate those ideas yet. The purpose is simply to observe that they have a history. They developed within a particular historical context. They were taught, they were discussed, they were spread, and eventually they were inherited by later generations of believers. But perhaps an even greater influence came through something that many Christians already had sitting on their shelves: a study Bible, specifically the Scofield Reference Bible. C I Scofield. When the Scofield Reference Bible was first published in 1909, it became far more than a Bible with helpful notes. Scofield had adopted and systematized many of the dispensational ideas associated with John Nelson Darby, and by placing those ideas directly alongside the biblical text, he gave them something Darby had never possessed: a vehicle capable of carrying an interpretive framework into the homes and churches of ordinary Bible readers on an enormous scale. And the influence did not stop with individual readers. The dispensational framework presented through Scofield also became influential within Bible institutes and theological schools, including institutions such as Moody Bible Institute and, later, Dallas Theological Seminary. Those institutions trained pastors, missionaries, Bible teachers, and ministry leaders who carried those interpretive ideas into churches and ministries throughout the 20th century. Meanwhile, the Scofield Reference Bible itself became extraordinarily popular. By the end of the Second World War, more than 2 million copies had been sold. Think about what that means. Darby's ideas no longer had to spread primarily through his own writings or preaching. They were now printed directly beneath the biblical text in one of the most influential reference Bibles of the 20th century, while generations of pastors and Bible teachers were being trained within institutions where dispensational interpretation had become deeply established. Again, none of this tells us whether dispensationalism is right or wrong. That is not the point of this particular study. The point is that ideas have histories, and the history helps explain how an interpretive framework developed in the 19th century could become so familiar by the 20th century that millions of Christians encountered its conclusions before they ever knew there was a name for the system. Most Christians understand the difference between the biblical text and a commentary sitting on a bookshelf, but a study Bible creates a unique situation. The biblical text appears on the page, and immediately beneath it appears an explanation. For many readers, especially new readers, the distinction between the text and the interpretation can become blurred. Without even realizing it, we can begin to read the interpretation and assume we are simply reading the text itself. Now let me be clear. There is nothing wrong with study Bibles. I own study Bibles. Many of them contain valuable information. Study notes can be extremely helpful. The danger arises when we forget what they are. They are interpretations. They are explanations. They are not inspired scripture. That distinction matters. Because once an interpretation becomes widely accepted, people often stop questioning it. It becomes part of the lens through which they read the Bible, and eventually that lens becomes invisible. At that point, many believers are no longer aware that they are looking through a particular interpretive framework. They simply assume they are reading the text plainly. I know this because I did myself for many years. All of us tend to think our own assumptions are plain and obvious. That is precisely why examining assumptions is so important. This is one reason I find church history so helpful. History reminds us that many of the ideas we consider obvious were once new. History reminds us that every major interpretive tradition was learned from somewhere. History reminds us that assumptions have histories. And perhaps most importantly, history reminds us that popularity is not the same thing as truth. An idea may be popular and correct. An idea may be popular and incorrect. An idea may be ancient and correct. An idea may be ancient and incorrect. Truth is not determined by age. Truth is not determined by popularity. Truth is determined by whether a claim accurately reflects what Scripture teaches. Again, I just can't stress that enough. And that brings us to a very important danger. When we inherit a view from trusted teachers, traditions, books, conferences, study Bibles, or denominations, it becomes easy to assume that the case has already been settled. It becomes easy to stop asking questions. It becomes easy to stop examining evidence. And that is exactly the situation addressed by one of the most important proverbs in all of Scripture, a proverb that should shape the way every student of the Bible approaches difficult subjects. Hermeneutics checkpoint. Before moving on, ask yourself a few honest questions. Can I clearly distinguish between the biblical text and the interpretations I have inherited about the text? Do I know where my current prophetic framework came from? Have I examined it personally? Or have I simply assumed it must be correct because trusted people taught it to me? Those questions are not intended to create doubt. They are intended to encourage investigation. Because examined beliefs are usually stronger than inherited beliefs. Truth does not fear examination. It invites it. Chapter 7. Proverbs 18:17 and the danger of early conclusions. There is a proverb that has influenced the way I approach difficult subjects more than perhaps any other. It is not a prophecy. It is not a complicated theological argument. It is a simple observation about human nature. Yet it has profound implications for how we study the Bible. Listen carefully to these words. The first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. Proverbs 18:17. At first glance, that may seem like a straightforward statement about legal disputes, and certainly it applies there. Imagine a courtroom. A witness takes the stand. He tells his story. His explanation sounds reasonable. His evidence appears convincing. Everyone listening begins to nod their heads. Of course he is right. How could anyone possibly disagree? Then a second witness enters the courtroom. The second witness presents additional information. New evidence emerges. Details appear that were not previously considered. Suddenly, the situation is no longer as simple as it first appeared. The first witness sounded convincing, not necessarily because he was correct, but because he was the only witness we had heard. That is the wisdom contained in this proverb. The first explanation often sounds right, not because it has been proven, not because it has survived examination, but because it has not yet been examined. And that principle applies far beyond courtrooms. It applies to history. It applies to politics, it applies to science, it applies to theology, and it certainly applies to eschatology. Think about your own experience. Most of us encountered a particular end-time system long before we ever began studying eschatology for ourselves. Perhaps it came from a pastor. Perhaps it came from a denomination. Perhaps it came from a prophecy conference. Perhaps it came from books. Perhaps it came from a study Bible. Perhaps it came from Christian movies. Whatever the source may have been, it was often the first explanation we heard. And because it was the first explanation we heard, it felt natural. It felt obvious. It felt biblical. Then one day we encountered someone who disagreed. Suddenly we discovered that another interpretation existed. Another explanation existed. Another perspective existed. And for many people, that moment is deeply uncomfortable. Not because they have discovered the other person is correct. And not because they have discovered the other person is incorrect. It is uncomfortable because they have discovered that the issue is more complicated than they previously assumed. That realization can feel threatening, but it does not need to be. In fact, it can be one of the healthiest moments in a believer's growth, because it forces us to move beyond inherited conclusions and begin examining evidence. Now let me clarify something important. The solution is not endless skepticism. The solution is not doubting everything. The solution is not assuming that every view is equally valid. The solution is investigation. The solution is examination. The solution is patiently weighing evidence. That is precisely what Proverbs 18:17 encourages. The wise judge does not immediately accept the first explanation. The wise judge listens, investigates, examines, tests, and only then reaches a conclusion. Likewise, the wise student of Scripture does not simply accept a prophetic framework because it was the first one he encountered, nor does he reject it merely because someone challenged it. Instead, he examines the evidence, he asks questions, he studies the text, he follows the argument wherever the evidence leads. That is the attitude we want to cultivate throughout this series. Because if we are honest, many of us have experienced moments where an interpretation seemed unquestionably correct until we encountered evidence we had never previously considered. Perhaps the new evidence strengthened our original conclusion. Perhaps it changed our minds. Either way, the process of examination was beneficial. Why? Because truth has nothing to fear from investigation. If a belief is true, careful examination will not destroy it. It will strengthen it. And if a belief cannot survive examination, then we should be grateful to discover that sooner rather than later. This is why I often encourage people to test what they believe, not because I want them to abandon their convictions, but because convictions that have been tested are usually stronger than convictions that have merely been inherited. And that brings us to the most important question of the entire lesson. If assumptions can influence interpretation, if traditions can shape expectations, and if historical developments can affect how we read Scripture, then what question should we be asking when we approach a biblical text? Hermeneutics checkpoint. When was the last time I seriously examined the reasons for my beliefs? Not the beliefs themselves, the reasons for those beliefs. Could I explain the evidence that led me to my conclusion? Or am I relying primarily on the authority of others? There is nothing wrong with learning from others, but eventually every believer must learn how to examine evidence personally. Chapter 8. The question we must learn to ask. As we bring this lesson to a close, I want to return to a question that will guide everything we do throughout the rest of this series. In many ways, this single question is more important than any prophetic chart, timeline, or interpretive system we will examine. It is the question that sits at the heart of hermeneutics itself. When we open the Scriptures and begin reading a passage, what question are we actually trying to answer? For many people, the first question is something like this: what does this verse mean to me? Now, to be sure, I do understand why people ask that question. We all want to know how Scripture applies to our lives. We all want to know what lessons we should learn and what changes we should make. Application is important. In fact, application is one of the reasons Scripture was given. But there is a problem if application becomes our starting point. If we begin by asking what a passage means to us, we may unintentionally skip over a more important question. Before we can know what a text means to us, we must first know what the text meant to the person who wrote it and the audience who originally received it. Think about how we approach ordinary communication. If someone sends you a letter, you do not begin by asking what you would like the letter to mean. You begin by asking what the author intended to communicate. If someone writes a contract, a set of instructions, or an important message, the meaning is not determined by the reader. The meaning is determined by the author. The reader's responsibility is to understand what the author intended to say. In many ways, biblical interpretation works the same way. This is why I repeat a statement that some of you will probably grow tired of hearing before this series is over. I do not care what a passage means to me. I do not care what a passage means to you. I do not care what a passage means to my favorite teacher, my denomination, or my tradition. I want to know what it meant to the man who wrote it. I love the way my brother Cody puts it. He says, I want to know what it means if you and I don't exist. If Isaiah wrote something, I want to know what Isaiah intended to communicate. If Daniel recorded a vision, I want to understand what Daniel was describing. If Matthew recorded the words of Yeshua, I want to understand what Matthew intended his readers to hear. If John wrote the book of Revelation, I want to know what John was communicating to the churches that first received that book. Now, that does not mean we can always arrive at perfect certainty. There will be difficult passages. There will be questions that remain debated. There will be texts that require careful study and patient examination. But even in those situations, the goal remains the same. We are not trying to create meaning. We are trying to discover meaning. We are not attempting to impose our ideas onto the text. We are attempting to draw the author's intended meaning out of the text. That distinction is one of the most important differences between responsible interpretation and irresponsible interpretation. When we approach prophecy, this principle becomes especially important. It is very easy to open Revelation, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, or Matthew 24, and immediately begin connecting everything to modern headlines, current events, political movements, or ideas we have inherited from our traditions. Sometimes those connections may ultimately prove valid. Sometimes they may not. But before we race to modern application, we must first ask what the original author intended to communicate. What did the symbols mean in their original context? What did the original audience understand? What themes connect these passages to earlier scriptures? What assumptions am I bringing to the text before I ever begin reading? Those questions slow us down. They force us to observe before concluding. They force us to gather evidence before constructing systems. They force us to become students rather than merely defenders of positions. And that is exactly what hermeneutics is supposed to do. Conclusion. As we began this lesson, we asked a simple question. Why do Christians disagree about the end times? By now, I hope you can see that the answer is often more complicated than many people assume. Christians do not disagree simply because one group loves Scripture and another group does not. They do not disagree merely because one side is sincere and another side is insincere. More often, disagreement arises because people bring different assumptions, different traditions, different experiences, different interpretive methods, and different historical influences to the text. The disagreement frequently begins before the passage is ever opened. Along the way, we have seen that Christians have not always agreed on every detail of eschatology. We have examined examples from church history. We have seen that different interpretive traditions developed over time. We have discussed how assumptions are inherited and how influential teachers, books, churches, and study Bibles can shape the way we read Scripture. Most importantly, we have seen that assumptions are often invisible until we intentionally examine them. We have also considered the wisdom of Proverbs 18:17. The first explanation often sounds convincing because it is the only explanation we have heard. That does not make it true. It does not make it false. It simply means it has not yet been examined. Wise people investigate. Wise people ask questions. Wise people examine evidence before reaching conclusions. If there is one lesson I hope you take away from this study, it is this. Do not be afraid to examine your assumptions. Some of them may prove to be correct, others may need adjustment, but truth never fears investigation. Truth does not need protection from evidence. If a belief is true, careful examination will only strengthen it, and if a belief cannot survive examination, then it is better to discover that now than to spend years defending something that was never properly tested. As we move forward through this series, we are going to practice asking better questions. We are going to learn how to identify literary genres. We are going to discuss symbols and imagery. We are going to examine context, audience, authorial intent, and the relationship between the Old and New Testaments. Most importantly, we are going to learn how to approach difficult prophetic passages in a way that seeks understanding before conclusions. Because ultimately, this series is not about teaching you what to think about the end times. It is about teaching you how to think about the Bible. Final hermeneutics checkpoint. Before moving on to the next lesson, ask yourself these questions. What assumptions am I bringing to Scripture? Where did those assumptions come from? Have I ever examined them carefully? And am I willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads? Those questions may prove more important than any prophetic chart we will ever study. In this lesson, we have focused on assumptions and the role they play in interpretation. But identifying assumptions is only the beginning. Once we recognize that assumptions exist, we must learn how biblical authors actually communicate. Do prophetic writers always intend their words to be understood literally? When should language be understood symbolically? How do we know the difference? And what happens when modern readers impose their own expectations onto ancient prophetic texts? In our next lesson, Video 2, Literal or Symbolic. Understanding prophetic language, we will begin exploring those questions and learning how the Bible itself teaches us to recognize prophetic imagery, symbolism, and apocalyptic language. Please continue to Video 2.